is accurate. And I guess that one of the responses that I would urge for you all to consider is that sometimes policy is explicit and almost material. And we tend to think that the absence of policy, right, what we've been trained up to think of when we think about deregulation is that that's the absence of law. That's the absence of policy. But that's not extraterritorial application of policy and objectives. I'd like to urge you to think about the absence of regulation as itself social ordering. So we make choices about whether we're going to have regulation to create a particular kind of social ordering and market and engagement with one another. Or we choose to remove regulations, knowing that those removals have implications for our social ordering as well. We were just talking about an example right before the panel, but I'll share with you as an example. The United States has a number of bilateral investment treaties with other countries. A bilateral treaty is a direct agreement with one other country that basically serves as a contract. It's an agreement about how the two countries are going to treat each other in their relationship with each other when they host each other's corporations. Okay? The United States is a strong advocate of its own bilateral investment treaty model, and we use that model all over the world. And we have, well over 100 of these bilateral investment treaties that are based on one model. A place I know really well is Colombia. We have a bilateral investment treaty with Colombia, and part of that bilateral investment treaty says that U.S. companies will be treated equally with Colombian companies. That sounds fabulous, right? It sounds great. Everybody should be treated equally. We like equal treatment. That's something that we've been raised up as, to think as being fair. Let me give you an example of how that fair treatment ends up not really actually necessarily being fair. So there's the bilateral investment treaty that says that U.S. corporations and Colombian domestic entities must be treated equally. Fine. In addition, there's Colombian law that says that if you are going to plant a seed as a farmer, you must register that seed through a bureaucratic process with the government. Okay? So that the government knows what's being planted on its territory. Probably part of, I actually don't know this, but my guess is that it probably has something to do with the drug war. So Monsanto is operating actively in Colombia. And Monsanto sells seeds. This is what they do. And they want to be treated equally with Colombian entities, right? So Monsanto has all the capabilities in the universe to go through the bureaucratic process. They have mounds and mounds and mounds of lawyers and employees who are dedicated to this process, who know how to do it well. They have good relationships. I mean, they have lunch with the person who signs off on it, right? This is not surprising, right? There's a sort of structural ruling elite that take care of these kinds of things. Anyway, Monsanto knows how to do this very, very well. A peasant in rural Colombia has no idea how to do this. No idea. Let alone the money to do it, let alone the lawyer to do it, let alone the access to the office that does it. Cannot register seeds in their own country because of lack of access to the system, to the bureaucratic system that allows them to do that. It's impossible. It's actually impossible. So the result is that the Colombian who has farmed their land with their traditional seeds forever is now doing that act illegally. Monsanto is acting legally. Now if we apply apply the law equally to those two parties, the Colombian who is doing what they always did, used to be legal, now it's illegal. Monsanto can ask for enforcement, in fact sued under the bilateral investment treaty for enforcement of Colombia's seed registration laws. Because Colombia wasn't enforcing those laws for reasons that were protecting their own citizens. Now they have to because they were found to be in violation of the bilateral investment treaty and wanted to avoid those problems. And so now peasants planting their own seeds are being thrown in jail and dispossessed of their land. That creates insecurity within Colombia and a lack of goodwill toward the United States and towards a U.S. company, somebody who we are sending, an entity that we are sending there facilitating through our bilateral investment treaty. That creates a sort of bad will through an intentional set of regulations or deregulations, however it is that you want to look at it. So it's not always the case that deregulation doesn't create a system of social system and a set of consequences. It does. And the only question is, what do we want that system to be? What do we want that social ordering to be? Do we want it to be a system that is that brings the idea of development and investment into sort of coalescence and friendship with the idea of human rights and basic human well-being, or do we want those things to be in opposition? Because development, that idea of development and human rights, seems sort of inane that they should be in opposition, but they often are for reasons like the story that I just told you.
I know in our discussion group we brought up the idea of the cartels in Mexico and Latin America being seen as a national threat as well as a domestic threat. We brought that up in parallel with the legalization and or decriminalization of many and all hard drugs as well as marijuana. And I was wondering how you saw the connection between our domestic education and investment issues alongside the national security issues that these organizations may or may not pose, and whether or not you saw them as more or less relevant than other organizations outside, or that are generally regarded in the public sphere as threats to the U.S. Especially because I'm in Professor Spechler's class and she's pretty cool.
Nevertheless, I'll defer.
Actually, I have a thought, but I just answered the last one, so I'm a little hesitant. But how about this? I'll answer this one, and then I'm going to just like lay back for a little bit. Another story. I do field work in Colombia, and mostly I've been working on mining issues. And a similar story to the one I just told you about seeds, but this one involves a miner, a gold miner. The activities that he's been doing, literally 400 years, they've been doing the same activity. It's been legal. His particular mine, he's been the owner of it for 60 years. He knows that what they do there, they've been doing the same way for 60 years. However, the mining code was revised in 2004, mostly by Canadian companies. So we're not talking about US, but US has similar kinds of policies, so by analogy. And that mining code now makes a lot of what he does illegal. So that if the mining code is applied equally to foreign entities and to to Colombian entities, what the foreign mining companies are doing is legal with respect to labor practices and environmental practices that we wouldn't disagree with, right? Like, don't use cyanide and pour it down the rivers, right? But the quantities that they're talking about with respect to large mining companies are massive and would kill us all if we were downriver. And the small quantities that small miners, ends up in the river, we don't want it there. But to close them down means all of a sudden this miner who's been doing what he's been doing for hundreds of years is now doing something illegal. The result, literally, during an interview, a day-long interview, I got to know this guy pretty well, and this guy at various points in the day was crying because his entire way of life is about to disappear. And he said, listen, honestly, if I could find a guerrilla organization that had the philosophies that the guerrillas had in the 1970s, I would sell every ounce of gold in my mine to them. I would give it to them. I would become a guerrilla. I would become a guerrilla fighter through my gold mine. That's happening all over Colombia. That is happening all over Colombia. It's happening all over Latin America, not just in Colombia, right? This is the place I know best, but it's happening in Nicaragua, it's happening in Panama, it's happening in Mexico, it's happening in Guatemala, through the same sorts of applications of the law. Take away legal, viable, economic opportunities for young people and middle-aged people who are in the height of their economic productivity. Take that away. What you have left is the choice to either not be economically active and a drain on society, or to engage in illegal activity, right? And we know that illegal activity has actual consequences. It is having consequences on our borders. The entire immigration fight is because we have destabilized the viable economic life of so many people in Latin America. Not us alone, right? And I don't mean that. I mean we. But the sort of that system that I'm talking about is destabilizing to the economic viability and life and opportunity of many, 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 many thousands of Latin Americans, and that does have impacts on our borders.
And I'll pick up right from there that, yes, insofar as the operation of these drug cartels in Mexico and elsewhere really leads directly to the intensification of violence. The United States doesn't benefit from violence anywhere, and certainly not on its borders. And when there's political instability, when the possibility of immigrants or refugees pouring into the United States is present, when American law enforcement may need to become involved in a far greater degree, these all impact directly on American national security. But also, you know, now that we are implicitly in this panel, I think very rightly broadening the concept of national security to refer to whatever impinges on the well-being or welfare of Americans, however diverse their interests might be. There's no question that the role of drug cartels in assisting the flow of drugs into the United States has a terrible impact on the well-being of Americans in all kinds of ways. So are they a threat? Absolutely. I have no hesitation in suggesting that.
Professor Cullather, you talked about how the three main entities are global order, global economy, and American values. So with the way that the world is globalizing and the rising developing powers of China and India, is it possible in the future for the U.S. to shape the international economy so that the global order benefits us in the same way that it has in the past?
Yeah, I mean, the rise of India and China actually could and should be to our benefit. The creation of large middle classes in those countries that can consume more goods could bring about a kind of revitalization of the global economy. In fact, I think that's probably the best chance the world economy has for pulling forward. The question is whether the kind of global economy that we're creating is one that benefits all Americans. And so therefore, this goes to Professor Spechler's point about my definition of national security in the 20th century and how it differs from the way in which we think about it today. In the 20th century, it was the case that presidents and other leaders could connect benefit of foreign policy gains overseas and the wealth that was bringing to Americans directly to the livelihoods of many Americans. Today, our economy is based around these ideas of rule of law, property, and contract. So for instance, one of the things that the United States is actively protecting around the world in the globalized economy that it's creating is intellectual property. I'm pretty sure that's the basis of the Seeds Law in Colombia. How many of you own international intellectual property? How many of you have received royalties from music that you've performed or recorded? How about books you've written? No? Seeds you've produced, scientific developments? So there are people in America who benefit from that, and Professor Spechler is correct. The United States is richer. But how many Americans constitute that United States? How many Americans get the benefits from the type of globalized economy that the United States is actively trying to create? It's getting to be a smaller and smaller part of Americans. And that's going to cause problems in the future of sustaining those foreign policies, I think. Because at some point, Americans will realize it and not want to support them anymore.
I threw in a couple of responses as well to your very good question. If I understood the heart of your question, it was, can the United States shape or continue to shape the international global order, particularly economic order? And my 2 cents here would be America has a declining ability to do that, simply because the weight, the role of the American economy in the global economy is diminishing steadily, and that's not likely to be reversed. And so the less the economic impact we have, the more difficult it is for us to play this central and critical role in shaping the global economy.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Do you feel that America needs to play a central role? Does it have to be a global superpower, or should we focus more on an insular policy? It's just a broad question.
Okay, I guess I go first. I mean, you have to have a mix of both, I believe. If you just all of a sudden become isolationist and forget about the world, you're not projecting your values, you're not projecting influence, you lose control of some of the outcomes that we've benefited from in the past. But at the same time, from my introductory remarks, if you don't get things right at home, all of the effort we take in, opening new markets and protecting intellectual property, are we benefiting? And I go back to, I want to comment on the previous question about do all people benefit? Are we really developing a society that's oriented to benefit from the society we seem to want, where everyone is, engineers and scientists and does great, highly educated, or is it going to be a society that's different than that? And I think we're sometimes fooling ourselves to think that we're all supposed to go to college and all supposed to have jobs in finance and law and in chemistry and engineering. So I think we have to have a little harder think about exactly what kind of people we want to educate, what kind of economy we want to have. We can't ignore what's going on in the outside world. It's at our detriment.
I'd like to reinforce that. Just as Professor Ochoa said very wisely, a decision to deregulate or not to regulate is a choice, and it's a choice for the environment in which one operates. We are enormously affected, in fact increasingly affected, I would say, by the state A of the global economy and B of the global world order. And a decision simply, and this is not to say that a question of priorities, that we should be interested in the rest of the world and ignore what's happening at home. I absolutely don't mean to say that. But is it imperative for the United States to try to create a world that is beneficial to Americans? Yes. Now, some interesting questions have been raised by Professor Ochoa and others on the panel. When America acts, does it necessarily act in the interest of the majority of Americans? And one might even say, rephrase the question, given the nature of American society and the structure of the American economy, is it possible for the U.S. government to act in the interest of the majority of Americans? I won't go there, but it's a question worth thinking about. Having raised the question for the moment, let me say, I think we should try. That it would be a mistake not to try to attempt to shape the kind of global order that we think is right, and it would be wrong for Americans like yourselves to, and I don't think there's a danger that you'll do it, to ignore what's going on or to ignore what our government is doing in the rest of the world. It's imperative that our government be active, but that American citizens monitor what the government is doing and express a voice as to the wisdom of what America is doing.
So, I want to kind of get into a question that was, it kind of came up during the opening speeches of Professors Cullather and Spechler in regards to, does the U.S. support democracy anymore? And the point you used was Ukraine, saying that because the U.S. supported the protesters, they were therefore anti-democracy. And I guess I want to hear a larger debate about whether or not the protests themselves were an expression of democracy, as all over the world, not even in Ukraine, more like Arab Spring, Venezuela, and if in fact that those are statements. I'd like to know if you guys think that those are in fact statements of democracy when a group becomes satisfied with their government that they're willing to violently overthrow them.
A lot of it depends on whether they're a majority group. There were elections in 2010 that brought the current government to power in Ukraine. There are going to be elections again next year. They're scheduled for next year. So the group that's protesting can't wait a year. They want this government to be overthrown now. Now, there's a tremendous similarity between what's happening in the Ukraine, to go back to the first part of your question, and what's happening in Thailand, where there's a group of protesters, again, thought to be a minority, but a very dominant minority because they're in the capital city, who want the current elected government of Thailand to be kicked out. And in that case, the United States is supporting the elected government, saying that that government stands for democracy, and that the protesters, the anti-government protesters as they're called, are in fact anti-democracy protesters. The cases are quite similar, yet the United States has opposite positions on how it stands vis-a-vis democracy in those two countries. So the United States, at best, what you could say is has an uneven position on the relevance of democracy to upholding its principles around the world.
I would like to add that have we always consistently supported democracy in the world? I mean, the whole notion that in many ways we're better at least talking about it today than in the past. I mean, we can probably bring up countless examples of U.S. choosing strategic interests over democracy promotion, whether that's in Egypt, Iran, you know, the coup d'etat in the 50s, you know, yeah, come up with plenty of examples, right? You can look at, you know, how we're not pushing the Saudis to have elections and let people have the right, you know, give women equal rights. So we have to kind of, you know, sometimes our rhetoric is bigger than what we actually do. And if that's right or wrong, I know that's for you guys to think about. For someone who thinks about national security, if you look at the history of the United States, a lot of it's been determined by what's the strategic interest of the United States, and that's the policy that we decided to pursue.
I would just say, since we were invited to debate, I want to avoid, and not that you were engaging in it, but I want to avoid in what sometimes is a slippery slope, and that is because we don't always support democracy, should we ever? And the answer is yes. That consistency, as one philosopher put it, is the hobgoblin of little minds. When we can do something good, we should do it. However, I would also want to throw out there that I'm not sure that the support for democracy is, or that is for an elected official, is per se always the best thing that America should do, or always the best representation of American values, when a democratically elected leader, as in Egypt or as in Ukraine, exercises extremely brutal policies. I'm not sure that America should necessarily be supporting that leader simply because he was democratically elected, or because an election might or might not be held in another year. So there's some things to think about.
Talking about democracy, it made me think of, you know, the United States' own democracy, and that poses the question, can the United States form international policies and national security policies without large corporations, because they have their nails dug into politicians with things like lobbyists, campaign contributions, and, you know, the fact that politicians are always constantly in a state of re-election? Do you think it's actually possible to make positive reform with this bureaucracy that we have?
I think it is possible because it has been done in the past. At the height of the Cold War, the United States had as many corporations as it has now, and the corporations were certainly as influential. But frequently, the United States would make decisions that actually hurt domestic corporations in order to advance some security interests which they saw as being more imperative. So is it possible? Yeah, I think it is possible. But I think you've got your finger on a real problem there, that in the absence of some driving national security interest that unites the government, corporations probably do have a lot more influence.
I guess I would say that there are many, many situations in which corporations will have a very narrow interest. They'll have an interest, a given corporation will have an objective in manipulating, say, a local legal system in a certain way. There's an enormous area of American policy all the time in which corporations are not necessarily active, where there's no red flag rising in corporate headquarters. It says, wait a second, we have to move in and stop this. And so I would say, yes, there's a great deal of leeway. Or another way to put the question we were just given is, can America ever do any good in the world given the impact of American corporations? I would say, yes, we have, and we can.
Let me add a little bit to that. So, it seems to me that there's a lot of threads that have come out during this discussion, and you know, we could go on for quite a while just adding threads, let alone, you know, trying to sort of see which ones of them actually tie together and which ones of them sort of, you know, sort of can spread out into a nice sort of story. the question of corporate influence in our own democracy, I think, is actually, I think it's a great question. It's a great question because it actually is relevant to the question of national security. And it's relevant in a number of ways that, again, I think we could sit and brainstorm for a long time about the number of ways that corporate influence is relevant to national security in our democratic system, or, I think depending on the day, or depending on the person, we might see that democracy eroding and or not. One of the things that I guess I would like to say, I would like to actually challenge Professor Cullather. I actually think that corporations, first of all, the number of transnational corporations has multiplied significantly since the Cold War. Their economic power has multiplied exponentially since the Cold War, and the role of corporate spending in American elections has changed significantly since the Cold War, and also in the ability to have influence over judicial appointments. Or judicial elections, sorry. And so I actually think that in recent panels, just in the last couple of years, I've been struck by the way that conversations about business and human rights, which used to just be about the role that businesses have in not violating human rights when they go abroad, have started to convert into conversations about rethinking our political economy. Because the political economy that we seem to, because people are becoming frustrated with the political economy that we live in. In a number of panels over the last few years, the idea that we're living in something other than a democracy, in a sort of an unnamed system in which corporate power is really the dominant force, is moving beyond sort of the theoretical doomsday fantasy, and something more like into legitimate academic theory or analysis, and that's truly something that we should worry about, I think, if we're thinking about national security as normal citizens. And I mentioned something, I said I wasn't going to deal with taxation, but I just want to raise it just quickly, and I wish I had written down the statistics, but I didn't think that taxation would come up. But I would encourage you to look. So we do spend a tremendous amount of energy on national policy that advances our interests abroad, right? We say it's our interests that we're advancing abroad through bilateral investment treaties and through economic policy, through the World Trade, our influence in the World Trade Organization, and our influence over World Bank, policies of investment. We say that's us advancing our national interests. But I want to challenge that a little bit. It used to be, during the 1950s when that idea first was developed, it used to be that the personal income tax and the corporate tax was percentages that we don't recognize today. Things like 40%, 50%, 60% tax, right? I don't even want to guess what a huge percentage of the country would do if we even suggested raising to something like that. So it truly was in the domestic interest to advance corporate power, because when corporations were enriched, so were the American people. That's no longer true in so many cases. There's a Forbes magazine article that came out last year, and I wish I had it right now, right here. But in the list of the Fortune 500 companies, the number of companies that paid 0 taxes, not like 4% taxes or got a $2 million tax break. No, paid no taxes. Exxon, GE, lots of those corporations that we spend so much political power and finances in advancing their interests, make a ton of money and do not return any of that money to the United States, to you, to us, to this university, to every university in this country, to public education systems, to roads, to all of these things that they use and benefit from. And the question of whether we are spending political capital in advancing the interests of entities that are not returning redounding any of that benefit to us is a really, really important question. And it absolutely has to do with our national interest in the ways that I think Professor Preston was really trying to allude to, right? Or trying to point to. The question of, why our education system is corroding has a lot to do with our public investments in that education system. And sorry. Yeah.
Is there any correlation between the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the whole bipolar era of politics and the rise of this neoliberal perspective that you were talking about in your speech when it comes to national security?
I think there is. If you ever want to spend a half an hour unproductively, try out the Google Ngram viewer as a toy to play with. It allows you to put any word in, and it will tell you how commonly that word was used in years across the last 2 centuries. And if you put in neoliberalism and Keynesianism, the alternative, the 2 lines cross about 1992. Neoliberalism, been around for a long time, since World War II, gaining steam, but never really taking hold, really kind of takes off in the 90s. So there's a correlation there. I don't know whether it's, you can say it's directly causal. But I think there's a big part of that. I mean, as long as countries had the option of being socialist and having an ally in the Soviet Union, the United States could not, and other countries, could not aggressively push neoliberal policies that might hurt large numbers of people, particularly in the countryside. Because then you'd have uprisings that would be supported before long by Soviet grenade launchers and AK-47s and things like that. And so you simply had to follow policies that were more broadly based, egalitarian, and full employment policies, rather than policies that were directed at growth above all else.
It seems to me that a focal point of American foreign policy has long been unwavering support of the State of Israel. As Israel becomes increasingly hostile to its neighbors of both Palestine and escalates this whole stalemate with Iran, is this the most responsible action, and should we reconsider a more moderate line in this area?
I'll be glad to take that one. The question is, the question is premised on the notion that Israel is becoming more and more hostile to its neighbors and is responsible for escalating somehow a relationship with Iran. I'd like to suggest that neither element in those premises is correct. Israel is not becoming more hostile to its neighbors. As a matter of fact, as Iran pursues a policy of nuclear enrichment, and as nearly all international experts, let alone Western experts, think the acquisition of nuclear weapons, Israel's relations with many of its neighbors, both immediate neighbors and beyond, are becoming much warmer because a coincidence of interest is being perceived. There are quiet contacts now between the Israeli government and several of the Gulf governments, which are even more alarmed in many ways than the Israeli government, because they see themselves as the actual target of Iranian aggression, whereas Israel, they think, is simply an ideological target of Israeli aggression. And they welcome whatever Israel can do to deter Iranian power. Israel's relations with Jordan are excellent at the moment. And in part, the improvement in Israel's relations with some of its neighbors, both closest and a little farther beyond, has to do with the fact, with the situation in Syria. Insofar as Israel's neighbors are becoming increasingly hostile, first of all, I don't think that's true, that the Syrians and the Lebanese now are so deeply embroiled in their own problems and their own conflict that the level of hostility directed toward Israel is much declined. Israel has not become more hostile toward Egypt. Israel is desperately trying to sustain a peaceful relationship with Israel. So, number one, I don't think that's true. Secondly, is Israel escalating some kind of confrontation with Iran. No, Israel is very, very concerned about the Iranian program and very concerned with something that actually is happening, namely that as in the light of the recent provisional agreement that was reached in Geneva, the sanctions regime that brought Iran to the table in the first place is becoming attenuated, with investors from all over the world now pouring into Iran and looking for ways, if not immediately, then very soon, to reestablish productive relationships. And Israel is saying, we better be careful, because see what we're doing, that was a very hard-won set of arrangements, that sanctions regime, and that if we reduce its impact before there are really major concessions by Iran, the world is going to be in danger. So I don't really agree with the premises of the question.
I just have a question about how do you think China's rise to global significance will affect or has affected U.S.-Russian relations?
Someone else want to take it? Take it, but, okay.
That's a dear ballpark.
Well, essentially, China's rise historically actually tends to facilitate a close relationship between the United States and Russia in juxtaposition to that power. But what's been happening, particularly in the last decade, the same kind of scenario that I was outlining, is that China and Russia are moving much closer together. And that while both of them are now working quite diligently to increase their arsenals, their military power, they're doing it in part together. Some of China's most advanced fighter aircraft, for example, are being supplied by Russia. So what's been happening is that there are voices in Russia, but by no means unanimous among Russian decision makers, that say we need China as a counterweight to potential American hegemony and American aspirations toward hegemony. And so in the last decade, Russia and China have moved closer and closer together, and that probably has been accelerated by the fact that Chinese power has been expanding, and that China and its ability to counter the projection of American power is viewed as useful by the Russians.
So the other thing we kind of talked about in our discussion group was how domestic interests play into our national security perceptions. So how do you think education and healthcare kind of play into this discussion of our decisions that we make with foreign policy and national security?
I guess since I talked about it in my discussion, oftentimes they don't play enough of a role in how we think about foreign relations. But it's not hard to kind of project forward and look at how we think about education, how we educate people, how we challenge students, how the skills you build will actually lead to productive lives, then leads to economic power in the world and influence, and you can then shape values, versus a world where you're unprepared, you're overlooked for jobs, and the immigration system needs to be reformed in many ways because we need to bring more and more people in because we're not able to educate our own citizens enough in the actual skills you need to actually provide for yourself in this economy that we've designed. We've designed one in which we export everything we import everything we consume. We get foreign direct investments so that we can invest in us so we all can be creators of intellectual property. So we gotta, I think, have a really deeper look into education. What was your second domestic topic you wanted to look at?
Healthcare, and the reason I ask because of those and following the cartel question is because I really see the influence of drugs in America as something that's being mishandled on a policy level, creating a lot of that poverty and in-education cycle, not just miseducation, but in-education cycle that you referred to. Basically, if we decriminalize, I believe that we could go a long way towards helping our educational system and funding it with taxes and cutting down.
I would agree. Like decriminalization would be a great step. We have to rethink the drug war in general. It hasn't worked. So why are we putting users in jail and not rehabilitating them? When we come to the healthcare system, I lived in both France and the United States. Okay, the American healthcare system is an economic disadvantage in the world. Why would you want to have a company relocate here so then I can pay, you know, what's the current premium per family of four? About $14,000 a year. The corporation will pump in maybe $9,000 to $10,000 of that towards your premium. Or I can operate in a country where the state is taking care of a lot of healthcare. It's out of my whole, I don't have to hire all these HR people to handle it. I don't have to negotiate with insurance companies. Healthcare is something is a national disadvantage. And when I work with countries in my former profession that look at how they can be more competitive, they see the American healthcare system as a big negative because of how expensive it is, unproductive. And why would I, you know, they often fret and they have to, you know, their colleagues that work in companies that then operate in the United States, you know, are always griping about how hard it is just to provide health benefits to their employees, where in the country that they are headquartered in, they don't have to think about that. They can focus on their core business and not on a very costly endeavor like we have here.
Higher taxes.
Yeah, well, it's a trade-off, right? Yeah.
Let me, I just wanted to add, and you know, again, sort of going to be lacking numbers, which of course I would have had I, you know, prepared for your question. But it's a really important question that you asked. And two images that I've seen just in the last couple of days come to mind. And I'm sure you've both, actually maybe you haven't seen the second, but the first, you've certainly seen, I hope, charts of what incarceration rates were before the formal drug war. Now, no additional drugs were made illegal by the drug war. The question, what changed was our enforcement policies, right? How we enforced the legality or illegality of drugs. So you might actually be on the side of, you know, decriminalizing drugs, or you might be on the side of wanting drugs to still be illegal because you think that they're actually bad for us, and it sets a strong normative sort of line about whether, you know, engaging in drug taking on a regular basis is good or bad for you, whatever. But that's not necessarily the question. The question is, how do we enforce those rules, right? So we have the incarceration. If you look at a chart, if you haven't seen it, there's sort of you see. Again, I don't have the numbers, but you see this sort of constant rate of incarceration based on drug violations, and then right around the 1980s, this extremely steep slope going up, and it hasn't stopped going up. Now, if that is a chart, but it represents thousands of people who are in jail instead of being out in the world being productive, right? Because we've decided that we would, for whatever reason, rather have them there. Now, that is that's problematic. At the same, so that's one piece. The other image that comes to my mind is right before I came. I was on my Facebook and I got a link to a video that UCLA students produced very recently. Those numbers are stunning. It was a group of African American men standing together. Has anybody seen this video?
UCLA.
At UCLA. Yeah, it's a really, really important video, I think, for you to see. 2,000 people are admitted into UCLA every year. 33 of them are black. That, if you combine it with what we know about the incarceration rates under the drug, you know, who is incarcerated under the drug war policies, means that we would rather send a huge portion of our young population to jail than send them to school. That is not good policy for national security. That's flawed. Right? We're spending thousands of dollars, millions of dollars to incarcerate people who are raised in disadvantage, right? Who are raised in unideal environments, right? That, you know, channel them to illegal activity, the things that we've decided are illegal, and then we enforce those policies in ways that take them out of the possibility of contributing to economic life in this country, instead of spending those millions of dollars to send them to school. Right? Open opportunities, don't shut them. That is, these are choices.
Good time for one more question.
Sort of to touch on that, and also I think lobbying was touched on for a second. That's an issue that's pretty dear to me. And as far as like the security of our nation, I feel that people definitely should have an economical security. And as far as like a lot of people live paychecks to paychecks, and
my question for you guys is, do you think what role does a corporation have in obviously protecting and investing in its workers? But also, I know some places, even Switzerland has looked into, they've put forth ideas that maybe CEOs should never be allowed to make more than 25 times what their lowest paid employee would make, which I think is amazing, but that's neither here nor there. But what do you think, like, if we were to impose these things, obviously the right would have us believe that it would destroy our economy and it would send us into a death spiral. But I'm curious, you guys know far more than I would, what might happen, or what would be a good way to look into that as a way to protect American citizens?
It would mean taking a step back to a style of economic management and a style of foreign policy that was more common in the middle of the 20th century, where you had national economies that were bounded by the borders of nations. Globalization really cuts against that. A great book on this is Steve Powell's book about ExxonMobil. And the executives of ExxonMobil are constantly surprised in their meetings with State Department officials and other US officials when those American officials seem to think that because they're an American corporation, that they'll do things to help the United States. And they just have to laugh. There's nothing that they are interested in doing for the United States. Their actions are entirely fiduciary on behalf of their shareholders. And they see themselves as a country unto themselves. I agree with Professor Spechler that their interests are often quite narrow, and they don't intersect evenly with American policy, which often leaves big areas for latitude. But it's no longer the case that corporations see themselves as bounded within a country. And it may be that Sweden is able to still maintain enough of that older style of economic management that they can dictate those terms to corporations. But if the United States had to do that, those corporations would simply locate offshore.
You really think they would pull out entirely from America if that was the case?
Don't they do it all the time?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, we live in a world in which the largest corporations are all far and away multinational, with headquarters, if the headquarters happens to be in the United States, which is often not the case, then that's not critical. And where operations are global, and it's the easiest thing in the world to shift a bit more of one's operations to another country, that's for sure. No, one would need international regulation, which maybe should be another panel, if one wanted to put on those kinds of restrictions.
Okay, on behalf of everyone here today, I would like to thank the panelists, Cullather, Christiana Ochoa, Daniel Preston, and Dina Spechler.